If you ever doubt that God places his messengers in the places we'd least expect, then you haven't heard what happened on a dark stretch of highway outside Nashville on the night of September 14th. That's how I start every time someone asks me about that evening, because no matter how many times I tell this story, the reaction is always the same. People go silent, something shifts behind their eyes, and then comes the question they can't hold back. How did a man who slept under bridges know the one thing that no doctor, no therapist, and no amount of money had ever been able to reveal? My name is Rose. I'm 83 years old now. I spent most of my life working as a personal assistant to one of the most powerful women in America. And the story I'm about to tell you isn't something I read in a book or heard secondhand. I was there. I saw everything. And to this day, I still feel the weight of that night pressing against my chest every time I close my eyes. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Her name was Catherine Ashford. If you followed business news in the 90s and early 2000s, you'd know exactly who she was. CEO of Ashford Capital, owner of a pharmaceutical empire worth over $2 billion, and one of the most feared names on Wall Street. Catherine didn't ask for things. She demanded them. She didn't negotiate. She dictated terms. And for 3 decades, the world bent to her will. But behind the boardroom doors and the penthouse views, there was a woman no one ever saw. Catherine had lost her only son, Daniel, to leukemia when he was just 11 years old. That was 22 years before the night on the highway. And in all those years, I never once heard her say his name out loud. Not once. She buried his memory the same way she buried everything that threatened to make her feel weak, deep, silent, untouchable. After Daniel died, Catherine threw herself into work with a fury that frightened even her closest partners. She tripled the company's revenue in 5 years. She acquired hospitals, research centers, and pharmaceutical labs across the country. Some people said she was building something that could outlast the pain. Others said she was running from it. I believe she was doing both. There was one ritual that nobody understood. Every year on the anniversary of Daniel's death, Catherine would take her motorcycle, a vintage black Harley that Daniel had loved as a child, and ride alone through the back roads of Tennessee. No security, no phone, no destination, just her and the sound of the engine drowning out whatever was screaming inside her chest. I always dreaded those nights. I would sit in the office staring at the phone, waiting for her to call and say she was heading home, and she always did, until September 14th. That evening, the weather had been shifting all day. By 7 o'clock, the sky above Nashville looked like a bruise, swollen, dark, and threatening. I called her twice, no answer. The third time, her phone went straight to voicemail. I remember the exact thought that crossed my mind. Something is wrong. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that 30 miles south of the city, on a stretch of Route 12 where the streetlights disappeared and the woods swallowed everything, Catherine's motorcycle had broken down. The engine coughed twice and went dead. She pulled to the shoulder, her boots scraping against the gravel. The silence that followed was absolute. No cars, no headlights. Nothing but the sound of crickets and the wind cutting through the pine trees. Catherine stood there for what felt like a long time, staring at the lifeless machine, feeling something she hadn't allowed to surface in over 2 decades, helplessness. She reached her jacket for her phone. The screen was dark, dead battery, and that's when she heard footsteps. They came from the tree line, slow and deliberate. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man in a worn-out coat carrying a small canvas bag over one shoulder. His face was deeply lined, his beard streaked with gray, and his shoes were barely holding together. He stopped about 10 feet from her and looked at the motorcycle. Then he looked at her, and there was something in his gaze that Catherine would later describe as the kind of peace that doesn't belong to this world. "Looks like you could use a hand," he said quietly. Catherine's instinct was to step back. She had survived boardrooms full of predators. She had stared down senators and silenced billionaires with a single glance. But standing on that empty road, With no phone and no way out, she realized something that turned her stomach. For the first time in decades, she had absolutely no control over what was about to happen. "I don't need help," she said, but her voice cracked on the last word. The man didn't react. He set his bag on the ground, walked calmly toward the motorcycle, and knelt beside the engine. His hands moved with a precision that seemed impossible for someone in his condition. Steady, careful, almost surgical. Catherine watched him in silence, arms folded, jaw tight. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The man worked without uttering a single word, occasionally tilting his head toward the sky as though listening to something only he could hear. Then, without looking up, he said something that made Catherine's entire body go rigid. Daniel would have loved this ride. The name struck her like a fist to the chest. She stopped breathing. She couldn't move. She could only stare at the back of that man's head while her mind raced through every possible explanation, and found none. The world knew that Catherine Ashford had lost a child. It had been in the papers years ago. But no one knew about the motorcycle. No one knew that Daniel used to sit on that exact Harley in the garage of their old house, pretending to ride across the country, making engine sounds with his tiny mouth while Catherine stood in the doorway, laughing so hard her eyes would fill with tears. That memory belonged to her, only to her. No one alive shared it. "How do you know that name?" Catherine whispered. The man rose slowly, wiped his hands on the front of his coat, and turned to face her. The look in his eyes held something that made her take a step backward. Not fear, but recognition, as if he wasn't looking at a stranger. And what he said next would set in motion something that no amount of science or money had ever been able to touch. "But before I tell you what that man said on that dark highway, you need to understand what had been unfolding inside Catherine's life in the weeks before that night. Because what pulled her toward that road wasn't just grief. It was something far more dangerous and far more divine than anyone could have imagined. If you're enjoying this story and want to find out what that homeless man really knew about Catherine's son, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next is something that still gives me chills every time I remember it. What no one around Catherine knew was that 3 weeks before that night on Route 12, something had begun to unravel inside her. It started with the dreams. The first one came on a Tuesday. She saw Daniel standing at the end of a long white corridor, looking at her without speaking. He was 11, the same age he was when he died. He held his hand out toward her, palm open, as if waiting for her to place something in it. Catherine tried to walk toward him, but with every step, the corridor stretched longer. She woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, at 3 in the morning. The second dream came. 4 nights later, same corridor, same boy. But this time, Daniel spoke. "You stopped listening, Mom." Catherine told no one. She doubled her work schedule, canceled every appointment that wasn't business-related, and filled every silent hour with noise. Meetings, calls, flights, anything to keep those 4 words from echoing in her skull. But the dreams didn't stop. They became more vivid, more urgent. And each time Daniel's voice carried something that sounded less like memory and more like warning. During that same period, something else began happening. Something Catherine dismissed as coincidence, but I could never ignore. A janitor at her office building, a quiet old woman who barely spoke English, stopped Catherine in the elevator one morning and said, "Someone in heaven is trying to reach you." Catherine stared at the woman for a long second, said nothing, and walked out. 3 days later, a taxi driver she'd never met turned around during a ride and said, completely unprompted, "Ma'am, I don't know why I feel the need to tell you this, but God says your son is not lost." Catherine fired her assistant that afternoon for leaking personal information. The assistant had leaked nothing. I watched all of this from a careful distance. I had worked for Catherine long enough to know that pressing her was dangerous, but I could see what was happening. The walls she had spent 22 years building were beginning to crack, and she was terrified. She stopped sleeping. She stopped eating full meals. Her hands developed a slight tremor that she hid from everyone by keeping them in her pockets during meetings. And then came the phone call. 5 days before the night on Route 12, Catherine received a call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. When she did, the voice on the other end was faint, almost like a whisper carried across a vast distance. "Catherine, it's time to stop running." The line went dead. She sat in her office chair for 40 minutes without moving. I know because I was watching through the glass door, too. Afraid to enter. That was the night she decided to take the motorcycle out. 5 days early. Not on the anniversary. Not following her ritual. Something was pulling her toward that highway, and she couldn't resist it any longer. What Catherine didn't understand, what she wouldn't understand until much later, was that every dream, every stranger, every whispered message had been leading her to one specific place, at one specific time, to meet one specific man. And that man was already waiting on Route 12, long before her engine ever failed. Back on that dark highway, Catherine was still, waiting for an answer. The man stood motionless in front of her, his eyes holding a steadiness that didn't belong to someone living on the streets. He hadn't answered her question. He hadn't explained how he knew Daniel's name, or the motorcycle, or any of it. Instead, he asked her something no one had dared to ask in 22 years. "When was the last time you talked to God about your boy?" Catherine's jaw tightened, her fists clenched at her sides. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to call him a fraud, a lunatic, someone who had somehow gotten lucky with a guess. But the words wouldn't come, because deep in the marrow of her bones she already knew this wasn't a guess. "I don't talk to God," she said, her voice flat. "God took my son." That conversation ended a long time ago. The man nodded slowly as if he'd heard that exact sentence before. "He didn't take your son, Catherine. He received him. There's a difference." Something cracked inside her chest. Not anger, not sadness. Something older. Something she had sealed shut the morning she watched Daniel's small casket disappear into the ground and swore she would never kneel before anything again. For 22 years, Catherine Ashford had waged a silent war against heaven. She donated millions to hospitals not out of compassion, but out of spite, proving she could save lives without asking God for permission. She built her empire as a monument to self-reliance. Every dollar earned, every deal closed was a whispered declaration, "I don't need you." And now, on a road with no lights, no audience, and no power left to wield, a man with holes in his shoes was dismantling every wall she had ever built, with nothing but the truth. "I don't know who you are," Catherine said, her voice breaking now. "But you need to stop." The man reached into his bag and pulled out a small, weathered Bible. The cover was held together with tape. The pages were swollen from rain and years of use. He opened it to a page that was marked with a single dried flower, small, white, pressed flat between the verses. "Your mother gave me this," he said. Catherine stopped breathing. Her mother Eleanor had died 9 years ago, a quiet woman who spent her entire life in a small town in Georgia, attending the same church every Sunday, praying the same prayer every night. Catherine had distanced herself from her mother's faith years before Daniel was even born. She considered it weakness, superstition, a crutch for people who couldn't face the world on their own. "You didn't know this," the man continued, "but your mother prayed for you every single day, for 31 years, without missing one, and before she died she asked God for one thing." He paused. "She asked him to send someone to you at the exact moment you'd be ready to listen." Catherine's knees buckled. She grabbed the side of the motorcycle to keep from falling. The night air felt heavier now, thick, pressing in from all directions, as if the sky itself was leaning closer. "I'm not ready," she whispered. The man closed the Bible gently and looked at her with an expression I would never forget. It wasn't pity. It wasn't judgment. It was patience. "You rode out here 5 days early, Catherine. No phone, no plan, no one waiting for you. You came to this exact stretch of road on the one night I'd be here." He tilted his head slightly. "You're more ready than you think." The wind shifted through the pines. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low across the hills. And in that silence between heartbeats, Catherine Ashford, the woman who had controlled everything, realized she was standing at the edge of something she couldn't buy, couldn't negotiate, and couldn't walk away from. And what happened in the next few minutes on that highway would prove that some doors only open when the last shred of pride finally falls. Catherine lowered herself onto the gravel beside her motorcycle. She didn't sit gracefully. She collapsed, like a building that had been standing on a fractured foundation for decades, and finally gave way. The man sat down across from her, the worn Bible resting on his knee. He didn't rush her. He didn't preach. He just waited, the way someone waits for rain after a long drought, with certainty, not impatience. "What's your name?" Catherine asked, her voice barely audible. "Samuel." "How did you know my mother, Samuel?" He looked down at the Bible, running his thumb across the taped. "Fine. Eleanor used to come to a shelter I stayed at in Macon. Every Saturday morning, she'd bring food, sit with us, read scripture. Most volunteers stayed an hour and left. Your mother stayed until sunset." He paused. "She talked about you constantly. Her brilliant daughter who was going to change the world. She never stopped believing that God had a plan for you, even when you stopped believing it yourself." Catherine pressed her palms into the gravel until the stones bit into her skin. "She never told me any of that. She didn't need to tell you. She told God. Every night. For 31 years. The weight of that number settled over Catherine like a physical thing. 31 years of prayers she never asked for. 31 years of a mother kneeling beside her bed, whispering her daughter's name into the dark, asking heaven to do what she couldn't. And Catherine had dismissed all of it. Every prayer, every act of faith, every quiet, invisible sacrifice, discarded as foolishness. "She gave me this Bible the last time I saw her," Samuel continued. "She said something I never forgot. She said, 'One day my daughter is going to need someone who still carries what she threw away. When that day comes, you'll know.'" Catherine's shoulders began to shake. Not from the cold, from something breaking loose that had been locked inside for longer than she could remember. "I threw everything away," she whispered. "After Daniel died, I blamed God for taking the only thing that mattered. I swore I'd never pray again. I swore I'd never need him." Samuel didn't flinch. "And yet here you are, on a road you chose 5 days early, with a dead engine and a dead phone, sitting in the dark with a stranger who's carrying your mother's Bible." He leaned forward slightly. "Catherine, does this feel like coincidence to you?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The tears falling down her face said everything. Samuel opened the Bible to the page with the pressed flower. Beneath it, in Eleanor's shaky handwriting, was a single verse circled in faded ink. He turned the book toward Catherine. She read it slowly, her lips moving without sound. And when she reached the end, a sound escaped her that I can only describe as something between a cry and a surrender. Raw, unchained. 22 years of sealed grief pouring out onto a dark Tennessee highway. "I need you to do something," Samuel said gently. "Not for me, not for your mother. For the boy who's been waiting for you to stop running." Catherine looked up at him through her tears. "Pray," he said. "Not the way the world prays, asking for things, making deals. Just talk to him, the way you used to talk to Daniel when you thought no one was listening. If this story is touching something deep inside you, maybe it's because God begins to move the moment we finally stop fighting him. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what Catherine did next on that dark highway changed everything. And what followed is something no one could have predicted." Catherine closed her eyes. The gravel dug into her knees. The wind wrapped around her like something alive. And for the first time in 22 years, she opened her mouth and spoke to the God she had spent half her life hating. She didn't recite a verse. She didn't bargain. She simply said his name. "Daniel." And then she said the only prayer that mattered. "God, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The moment those words left her lips, something shifted in the air around them. Not wind, not sound, something heavier, something ancient, as the sky had been holding its breath for 2 decades and had finally been given permission to exhale. Samuel closed his eyes and whispered something too faint for Catherine to hear. And what neither of them could see, what only heaven knew in that moment, was that the miracle Eleanor had been praying for across 31 years of faithfulness had already been set in motion, and it was only seconds away from arriving. What happened next on that highway is something I still struggle to put into words, not because I don't remember, but because language was never designed to hold what took place in the minutes that followed. Catherine was still on her knees. Her prayer had ended, but she hadn't moved. Her hands were open in front of her, palms facing the sky, trembling. Tears fell silently onto the gravel beneath her. Samuel remained still, eyes closed, lips barely moving. And then, the air changed. It didn't get warmer, it didn't get colder. It became something else entirely, heavier and lighter at the same time, as if the atmosphere itself had been replaced by something that didn't follow the rules of this world. Catherine opened her eyes slowly. The darkness around them was the same. The road was the same. The trees, the gravel, the dead motorcycle, all unchanged. But she felt something she hadn't felt since the morning Daniel was born. A presence, not beside her, not in front of her, around her, inside her, pressing gently against every broken place in her chest, like hands carefully holding together something that had been shattered for too long. She gasped, not from fear, but from recognition. "Daniel," she whispered, and then she heard it. It wasn't a voice. Not exactly. It was more like a memory that didn't belong to the past. Vivid, immediate, alive. The sound of a small boy laughing. The specific laugh Daniel had when he sat on that Harley in the garage, gripping the handlebars with hands too small to reach the brakes, shouting to his mother, "Look, Mom, I'm flying!" The sound filled the air around her, not coming from a direction, coming from everywhere. Catherine pressed both hands against her mouth. Her body shook as sobs erupted from a place so deep she didn't know it still existed. Samuel opened his eyes. A single tear ran down his weathered face. "He's here," Samuel said quietly. "He's been here the whole time." Catherine couldn't speak. She could only nod because she knew it was true. She could feel it with a certainty that bypassed her mind entirely and spoke straight to her bones. Daniel wasn't gone. He had never been gone. She had simply been too angry, too proud, too walled off to feel what had been standing beside her for 22 years. Then something happened that made even Samuel draw a sharp breath. The motorcycle's headlight turned on. No key in the ignition. No hand on the engine. The battery that had been dead for over an hour suddenly powered a single beam of light that cut through the darkness of Route 12 like a blade. Catherine stared at the light. Samuel stared at the light. Neither of them spoke. The beam didn't flicker. It held steady, pointing straight down the empty highway, illuminating a path through the dark that hadn't existed a moment before. And then, as quickly as it had turned on, the light went off. The highway returned to darkness. The crickets resumed. The wind moved through the trees again. But Catherine Ashford was no longer the same woman who had pulled over on that gravel shoulder an hour earlier. Something inside her that had been dead for 22 years had started breathing again. She looked at Samuel through the dark, her face streaked with tears, and said something she hadn't said to another human being since the day she buried her son. "Thank you." Samuel shook his head gently. "Don't thank me. Thank the woman who never stopped praying, even when you gave her every reason to." Catherine closed her eyes and pressed her mother's Bible against her chest. And in that gesture, something sealed itself in the heavens. A circle that had taken 31 years of prayer, 22 years of grief, and one impossible night on a Tennessee highway to finally close. But what happened after that moment, when Catherine returned to Nashville and the world discovered what had taken place on Route 12, turned out to be even more extraordinary than the miracle itself. Catherine rode that motorcycle home that night. The engine started on the first try, as if It had never been broken at all. She didn't question it. She didn't analyze it. She simply turned the key, felt the machine roar beneath her, and followed the road back toward Nashville with tears still drying on her face and her mother's Bible tucked inside her jacket. Samuel didn't come with her. When she turned around to offer him a ride, he was already walking back toward the tree line, his canvas bag over his shoulder, moving through the dark the same way he had appeared, quietly, without explanation. "Will I see you again?" she called out. He stopped but didn't turn around. "You don't need me anymore, Catherine. You never did. You just needed to remember who was already with you." And then he was gone. I was still in the office when Catherine walked through the door that night. I'll never forget the look on her face. It wasn't the face of a woman who had just experienced something extraordinary. It was the face of someone who had finally stopped carrying a weight she was never meant to hold. She didn't tell me what happened right away. She sat down in the chair across from my desk, placed the old Bible on the table between us, and said 5 words that rearranged everything I thought I knew about her. My mother saved my life. Over the following weeks, Catherine began to change in ways that stunned everyone around her. She stepped down as CEO of Ashford Capital. She redirected nearly half of her personal fortune into building shelters, rehabilitation centers, and free clinics across Tennessee and Georgia, every single one named after Eleanor. She found the small church her mother had attended in Georgia. It had been closed for 3 years. Catherine bought the building, restored it with her own hands alongside local volunteers, and reopened it on what would have been Eleanor's 89th birthday. But perhaps the most remarkable thing she did was something the world never saw. Every Saturday morning, Catherine Ashford, the woman who once commanded boardrooms and silenced billionaires, drove to a homeless shelter in Macon, Georgia. She brought food. She sat with strangers. She read scripture out loud with a voice that still trembled, because faith was still new to her and she was still learning how to hold it. She was looking for Samuel. She never found him. No one at the shelter remembered a man by that name. No records existed. No photographs. No one matching his description had ever been registered there. Not in 10 years, not in 20. It was as if he had never existed at all. Or perhaps he had existed for exactly one purpose, on exactly one night, on exactly one road. I asked Catherine once, years later, what she believed Samuel really was. She looked out the window for a long time before answering. "I don't know what he was, Rose, but I know who sent him." Catherine Ashford passed away 11 years ago, peacefully, in the same small town in Georgia where her mother had lived. She was 78 years old. She left behind no corporate empire, no penthouse, no Wall Street legacy. She left behind 43 shelters, 12 churches, and over 6,000 people whose lives were changed because one woman finally knelt on a dark highway and said the prayer her mother had been waiting 31 years to hear. And as for me, I'm 83 now. I've told this story more times than I can count, and every single time someone asks me the same question, "Rose, do you really believe a stranger on a highway can change someone's life like that?" And my answer is always the same. He wasn't a stranger, and it wasn't the highway that changed her. It was a mother's prayer carried across 31 years of silence that finally found its way home. If this story moved something inside your heart today, I believe it's because some messages aren't just stories. They're reminders. Reminders that God doesn't forget, that prayers don't expire, and that sometimes the miracle you've been waiting for has already been walking toward you, long before you even knew you needed it. Subscribe to this channel, because there are stories that aren't told to entertain. They're told to remind us that the impossible still happens, for those who believe.